Well, guys, I have done it. I have rewatched the entirety of Ninjago Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2. This is my second time watching the entire part front to back after my first time, which was immediately following the Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2 leak, where every episode of Part 2 was leaked on everybody's favorite streaming service known as Peacock. Now, it is no secret that during my initial watch, I was very upset because obviously the entire season was leaked 3 months early, and I don't think anybody was really happy about that. I've seen nothing but negativity throughout the Ninjago community. But following me sleeping a bunch and calming down a lot, I figured why not rewatch part 2? Maybe I will feel more positively now. Because, I am in a slightly better mood than I was my first time watching this. But I gotta say, after rewatching Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2 from front to back, no interruptions, I still have some issues with this season. However, I still have some really positive things to say as well regarding the entirety of Part 2, and that's exactly what this video is going to be. My updated thoughts on Season 2 Part 2 after I've watched through it twice. Like I said, we have some good things to talk about, also some bad things to talk about, but first, for a couple of quick disclaimers, this video will contain spoilers for Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2. You have been warned, spoilers are ahead. Also, I will not be able to use any screenshots nor footage from Season 2 Part 2 aside from what we see in promos, which as of right now only includes the 30-second teaser. I'm not going to take any chances by showing leaked images in the video because technically that's exactly what they are. And with all of those disclaimers out of the way, let's talk about Season 2 Part 2, starting with the good. What did I like about this part? Well, for starters, I loved the Tournament of the Sources. It was awesome seeing all these different fighters, elemental or non. Of course, we have the elemental competitors actually in the tournament. The non-elementals just kind of stand off to the side, either coaching or doing their own thing entirely in the case of Eren. I did like the tournament overall. I thought the tournament was handled really well. I love that there was an actual winner crowned in Sora. Well, I guess technically Noct, but Sora won the entire thing at the end, so good for Sora. I will say though, some elemental powers aren't the best, and I've talked about that a lot too. The elemental power of surface tension being one that is extremely questionable, but more on that here later. But I loved the tournament. I loved the tournament battles as well. I thought it was cool seeing each of these characters fight using elemental powers that belong to them and elemental powers that do not belong to them. More on that plot point here as well a little bit later. But no, I really enjoyed the tournament outside of a few specific plot points that we will get into here in a second. Do I think the tournament is better than Season 4's Tournament of Elements? I do not have an answer to that question just yet. I do plan on making a video later on, later this week, talking about the tournaments themselves, how they compare, and ultimately deciding which one I like more. But I gotta say, the tournament itself, I really enjoyed. I also loved the individual character moments, especially for Sora. Like I said, she wins the tournament, but she loses Eren. Very bittersweet ending to Sora's character there for this season. I also really enjoyed what Nia was going through, not only with losing Kai, but also with losing Jay, and of course having to fight Jay later on. And I guess I could talk about that really quick. I kind of liked the Jay versus Nia fight. I'm not crazy about what they did with Jay in general. More on that here in a second. But I did like the battle, and overall the fights in the tournament were really well done, highlighting again some awesome character moments that I feel like were crucial to have in this season. I also enjoyed a lot of the new characters that we saw for this part. I especially am fond of Frack, Eren's friend who's the master of Quake. Not crazy about his elemental power. Of course, it kind of reminds me of Heat a little bit, because you have fire, you have heat, you have earth, you have Quake. But I liked Frack as a character. He was cool. I'm happy that we are seeing more elemental masters that aren't human. I'm glad that we saw some serpentine elemental masters. Obviously, we have people like Geo as well. I think we need more of that. I also enjoyed how Lord Ras himself was handled during this part, and I'm very curious to see where his relationship with Eren goes from here, since they did escape together at the end of part 2. Who knows what they are up to now, and I imagine a lot of that will be explored in Dragons Rising Season 3. I'm excited to see what this season actually leads to. I do have a lot of other stuff that I enjoyed about this season as well, but I do plan on exploring a lot of these more in upcoming videos, so I don't want to, spoil my thoughts on everything here, but I did like a lot about this part. Now moving into some of the bad things that I did not like about this part, my overall issue with part 2 is that it doesn't really feel like a follow-up to part 1. And I guess in a way Dragons Rising Season 1 had this same issue, but Season 1 was very much a setup season. Season 2 is still trying to be setup for the most part, but it's set up for stuff that we aren't seeing pay off now, and it kind of feels like an entire season of just setup. And it's ironic because a lot of stuff that was set up in part 1 doesn't really follow through in part 2. Maybe a lot of this will be addressed later, but the Blood Moon is no longer relevant. I was sure that the Blood Moon would come back and play a pretty major role in part 2, considering how important it was in part 1. Also with Kai and Bonzel, there's not much going on there. I mean, sure, they enter Nether Space and they're kind of sneaking around the Forbidden Five the entire time, but there's no bonding between the two. They never have a moment where they actually sit down and express their thoughts. Bonzel especially kind of gets reduced to a background character. After having so much to do in part 1, she hardly does anything in part 2. I think there are even some episodes where she doesn't say anything at all despite being there. And like I said, I feel like that's my major issue with part 2. It doesn't really feel like a part 2 to the part 1 that we got. It almost feels like a part 2 to a different part 1 that we did not see. The tournament stuff, as much as I might have liked it, kind of comes out of nowhere here. I would have loved for the Blood Moon to have had more of an impact, and especially following our first look at the sets for this part, there's a lot here that doesn't really carry over into the final product, and I gotta say that was kind of disappointing to me. And let's talk about this really quick, right? With all of the Jay stuff, I feel like, again, this season is focused a lot on setting things up. At the same time, they don't really set up a lot of other stuff. Jay just kind of randomly shows up here, and it's like, okay, you're working for Lord Ras, clearly. How did that happen? What's the storyline there? Maybe we will find out in flashbacks later on, but I feel like Dragons Rising is kind of having this issue where they feel like everything needs to be a mystery. And not everything needs to be a mystery. And finally, let's talk about this really quick. As much as I loved the tournament and how it was set up, I feel like the plot point of the winner of each match gaining their opponent's power is kind of dumb, because I could see where it was headed immediately as soon as they mentioned it. I'm like, oh, eventually Noct is going to get every elemental power, which he does, to the surprise of nobody. And I feel like the only reason why this plot exists in the tournament, why this rule is even there, was to give Noct a way to have every single elemental power when they could have just done something different. If he needs the elemental powers so bad to free the rest of the Forbidden Five, let's just scrap that and bring back the Blood Moon, because the Blood Moon did the exact same thing, right? That would have tied it in more with part 1, and it would have excluded this really weak plot where, like I said, as soon as they mentioned that this was a thing, I knew exactly where the storyline was going here. Maybe the winner of the tournament could summon the Blood Moon or something like that. You know what I'm saying? It was just way too predictable, and I feel like there wasn't a lot to tie it into part 1, so doing something like this would have fixed both of those problems. And I will be talking about that more in an upcoming video and explaining more of what they should have done differently with that plot. And yes, it was cool to see some of the other elemental masters use powers that they would not normally use, like Nia using lightning or Sora using ice, but I don't know, man. I just kind of felt like that plot point really did not need to be there, necessarily. They could have focused the tournament on something else entirely. And I do have some other minor issues with this season that I will be addressing in later videos. I also have a lot more positive things to say about this season as well, also explained in upcoming videos. And overall, just to summarize my thoughts on Season 2 Part 2, I'm still very mixed after my rewatch. I feel like I am leaning more towards positivity though, but overall it is kind of a letdown from what we saw in Part 1. I loved Part 1 of Season 2 a lot. I had almost no issues with Part 1. Can't really say the same about Part 2, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least just a little disappointed. I feel like there are a lot of good ideas here, Execution, not so much, but I still had fun with this season, all things considered. I still enjoyed part 2 for what it was. I just feel like there are some pretty major issues that I can't help but not overlook, you know? As of right now, according to my own opinion, Season 2, Part 2 of Dragons Rising is the weakest part of Dragons Rising that we've seen of the 4, you know, of Season 1, Parts 1 and 2, and of Season 2, Parts 1 and 2. Season 2, Part 2 is the weakest one, in my opinion. In the meantime, like I said, let me know down below in the comments what you thought of Season 2 Part 2, and thank you so much for tuning in. If you guys enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will talk to you guys again very, very soon. Peace.